pages of printing. Like if I wanted to print out a mass mailing of 18,000 letters, would that fall under this expense account or somewhere else?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it would have to fall somewhere under this expense account going forward. You'll see a line that says printer lease at $500. That was the leases for the floor multifunction units that every department has to pay for. And that's just a distribution of that total cost. It's about $5,000 a year for the council office, so $500 per councillor was distributed.
Okay.
And that's just for the floor copying and printing, but anything above that would have to come out of one of these account lines, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Dillon.
Do you, Mr. Chair? So there's the two budgets there, one's 6,250, one's 4,300. Do those costs have to be used specifically for what they're identified with, for example, staff development or mileage, or can this all be used as one account?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think the intent was this would be all one account, which would essentially be 10,550, which is a 622.50 plus the 4,300. Those were just put there as sort of placeholders. When every department does budgeting, we budget by specific item to try and track our costs.
So the councillor uses his discretion, or her discretion, sorry, for the entire 10,550. Thanks.
That's something that the individual member would be accountable for. Yes.
Sorry, if I can add on to that as well, because I was reading in there, I don't know if we're going to get to it, but for that 10,550, the account it's in, there's an option for the P card. Is that correct?
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair.
The P card?
The P card?
Yeah, for that amount.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe P cards at this point have not been offered to the members, individual members of council, but I would defer to Finance and Corporate Services on that. It could be available.
Because it says in the report that it's available.
In the report from January?
No, in the agenda here.
The expense, the councillor and mayor, members of council expense
That's in the
policy.
next
Yes.
discussion of
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So Z will be here to speak to that item, and perhaps he can address that. But presumably, if members are interested in a P card, because it's a more efficient way to track expenditures, subject to city policy, that could be something that could be considered.
Right.
Through you, Chair. So yeah, we can do that. We've got training and a program all set up, so I'll work with Z, and would that be for all councillors, or?
So we had the opportunity to choose last term of council. Some chose, some didn't choose, and I think just for whoever feels that it might be more efficient to track expenses and to actually make purchases for the office, I think the option should be there.
And through you, Chair, I'd ask Z to speak to it when he's doing his presentation on how we would approve those.
Can I ask one more question? Chair be heard. So, on the 10,500, that's per year.
That's correct.
I don't know if the committee want. That cannot be part of the whole budget of the 200,000, or it has to stay where it is now.
Through you,
Because
Mr.
if we
Chair.
have that budget, something breaks, each one pitches in. We're adding an extra almost 42,100 per councillor at the end of the term, by the end of the term. It's going.
That's correct. When this proposal was put forward and council adopted this proposal, staff tried to separate for transparency purposes what would be a staffing component for councillors that elected to hire their staff, and what would be sort of a non-staffing, a non-labor component in terms of other expenditures. There's nothing in the policy today that says that those boundaries have to be kept. However, it would be a good principle to keep separation of those boundaries.
Well, just because it's $42,000 per council times 10, that's another $400,000 a year. In 4 years, $500,000.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct. However, what that $4,000 extra per year essentially represents is the existing budget that was already in place for the council office, allocating that out. So the additional cost that's, the additional $400,000 that's being allocated out to the councillors is being offset by the elimination of the council office budget.
Okay, I'm fine with it. Councillor Dillon?
Sorry, does that 10,550 carry over to the next year, or is it just for calendar year?
Through you, Mr. Chair, my understanding is it's per calendar year, and if it's not used, it, like any operating budget, it goes back to general revenues, and then a new 10,500 would be allocated next year, subject to budget approval.
Right, so just to the chair's point, I think, again, it does go back into the operating budget, but these are office expenses per se, and I think, I think what the staff tried to do was separate the actual salary portion from the office expenses.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, Peter.
Okay. So before we leave the shared small appliances and general office expenses, a proposed motion for committee's consideration, just to document the process going forward, would be that effective April 15th, with the implementation of the new model, shared small appliance and general office expenses to serve all 10 members of council on the 6th floor be expensed to individual member expense accounts on an equal shared distribution basis, charged quarterly. So that's just saying that those costs will be shared amongst all the 10 members. So the next part was on individual office supplies and administrative services. So we'll start on the left-hand side of the slide. So councillors are responsible to maintain their own inventory of general office supplies. There are lockable cabinets that are being provided to each member of council for you and your staff to store supplies, things like pens, highlighters, beverages, parking chits, staplers. Those will be things that you inherit with what you have from your staff, and if you need additional, you'll have to go through and order those from your expense account. As well, printing costs associated with the shared floor multifunction printers will be allocated out, as we discussed a few minutes ago. And then in terms of general office supply orders, Val, who's the designated council office assistant on the 6th floor, can process those orders on your behalf or on your staff's behalf. If you do so choose to make an order, it'll just be charged back to your account. On the right-hand side is discussion regarding councilors' use of city administrative services and facilities. And as staff has said in the past, leading up to this implementation, going forward, we are recommending chargebacks to individual councillor expense accounts for the following types of services. Namely internal printing and copying services. So if you send a print job down to the print shop to be copied, that will be charged back. Or if you have a specialized printing down there, which could include brochures, posters, business cards, things like that, that the print shop can do, that will be charged back to your individual expense account. Courier and mail services processed through the city will be charged back to your individual expense account. And then finally, we've put it in here for clarity, facility and rental permits, which are already in effect, will be charged back to your expense account if you're renting a city facility. So to operationalize this, we are recommending two motions. The first is that the general office supply orders for each councillor be charged to individual member of councillor expense accounts on an actual cost recovery basis at time of receipt. So if you order something from Staples, it comes in, it'll be charged to your account when it's received. And then effective April 15th with the new model, the following costs be expensed to individual member expense accounts on an actual recovery basis, charged quarterly for the following services. And we've itemized the three services: internal specialty printing, internal printing and copying services, and mail and courier services, and all related costs.
So I got some speakers. Councillor Santos?
Thank you, through you, Chair. So just a couple of questions, and I'll probably have comments later on too, but I've been looking at the Code of Conduct over the past couple of weeks or so, and specifically around the expense policy. And under item 6.6 in the existing expense policy, gifts to individuals, it breaks down the expenses of eligible expenses and ineligible expenses. Under ineligible expenses, item F, it says ineligible expenses include purchase of bags, pens, pins, or any promotional materials with a member of council's name. Does that include magnets?
Through you, Mr. Chair, my interpretation would yes.
Okay, so if a councillor, if I produced a bag with my name on it, or magnets or a pen with my name on it, who would be paying for that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure who would pay for it, but certainly the city would not be paying for it under the current
Okay.
policy.
And if the city is not paying for it, let's say that I paid for it myself, you know, my personal expense, would I be able to use this corporate mailing service or mailing under my own expense account to mail it to constituents?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we may be getting into hypotheticals there. We may be venturing into territory that probably those may be matters if there are specifics that may be for the Integrity Commissioner, because that would clearly appear to be contrary to the intent of the council expense policy. But if it's a matter that whether or not it's a contravention of the council code of conduct, because somebody chooses, they have the wherewithal to actually use their own resources to do promotion or fulfill their responsibilities as an elected official. I know there are other municipal jurisdictions, namely in Toronto, where that question has come up, and the Integrity Commissioner has essentially ruled that all councillors need to be treated the same, and essentially spend from the same pot. So a councillor with additional means can't use those additional means to further fulfill the role as an elected official. I'm speaking in code here because we're talking in hypotheticals, but the intent is that councillors have a discretionary expense account to be used in accordance with the expense policy. And they
And
shouldn't
so-
be using additional funds to supplement that.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, so if I did mail a whole bunch of magnets with my name on it to my constituents before this policy, what would happen?
So
Before
presumably,
today, before this political model?
through you, Mr. Chair, presumably if there was an expense attributable to that, it would be an expense that would not be, that would be contrary to the existing expense policy and would not be paid by the city.
Okay. And that includes the mailing as well? The mailing of the magnets?
The mailing is not covered today under the policy, and we've had multiple discussions at this committee about that, and that's why we're recommending this go-forward approach.
Okay. So now I just have a few, if I may, because I think there's other councillors who want to discuss as well. And quite frankly, I'm not a member of this committee, but I am here because I am concerned and have been concerned specifically about the extent of mailing services being used by individual councillors. And I'm happy that moving forward, that any of those expenses are now going to be specifically attributable to the councillor's expense account. And I'm hoping that councillors will consider making that retroactive to at least March the 4th. And somebody hopefully will pass a motion to make it so. I have been approached by members of the community specifically saying that I am attacking or a particular councillor, that these questions with respect to the mailings are putting one councillor out and I'm attacking them. I want to very publicly say that that is not the case. I spoke with the Integrity Commissioner, I've read the Code of Conduct, and our job is, as councillors, as elected officials, is to maintain the integrity of our roles and the ethical standards as set out by the Code of Conduct when it comes to using taxpayers' money. On a number of occasions, the Committee of Council, the Governance Committee, this committee, I don't know how many times we have brought up our concern as a team around the issue of mailings, and yet we still continued to find out that these mailings were happening. And I know that we do have numbers now going back from March 4th until today. Now, it reminds me of, as a parent, when I say to my son, you know, for the first time, when I say to him, Lennon, please don't do that, you know, it's not good. And then he says, yes, mommy, I understand, or just chooses to ignore me. And then the second time, you know, my son does it again, something wrong. And I say, Lennon, you got to stop it. Please stop doing that. And then a third, fourth time, at some point, you know, that my child is getting away with something that he knows is wrong. And so I think it's important to highlight, we were not under attack on anyone on this council. We have a legal obligation as elected officials to maintain the code of conduct, and I specifically spoke to the Integrity Commissioner about this. Luckily, my son doesn't have a code of conduct at home, but we do on council. And in the code of conduct, it says that we are held to a higher standard. And so even though the code of conduct exists not to find loopholes, to find ways to spend taxpayers' money, the code of conduct exists because we are held to a higher standard as elected officials. And so I am going to encourage my council colleagues who are on this committee to make it retroactive. Because in a memo that was sent to us on April 2nd, it appears that these mailings continue to happen, past January, past February, past March, into April, despite the countless reminders, expressions of concern about the spending of taxpayers' money. Now, we have friends in the area who have received these mailings, and I can say that there were magnets in the mailings. There was also promotions around a particular campaign website, which contradicts another portion of this code of conduct. And so we could deal with that perhaps later with the Integrity Commissioner. But at this point in time, when it comes to expenses, I do think that the mailings in particular should be retroactive to March 4th, when we were, as a staff, able to start tracking the issue. Thank you.
Councillor Dillon.
Pulling it up on my computer, sorry. Through you, Mr. Chair. If you can go back a slide real quick. What happens to the, couple questions. Number one, what happens to the existing office supplies?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I believe if constituency assistants have office supplies at their desk, they're inherited by the new the councillor and who they may be working for. And if there is if Teresa may be able to clarify this, if there's a storeroom of supplies, then presumably they will be allocated equally to all the members.
So like no garage sale or anything?
Not yet. Not yet, Mr. Chair.
So number two, parking chits. Is there a cost to the councillor for the individual parking chit?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that's a good point. There will be, just as there are for operating departments. If somebody comes in, a guest, and you're inviting them up and you wish to issue them a parking chit so they can get free parking downstairs, if they've been here longer than an hour, you can issue them the chit, and just like the clerk's office would, and it would be charged back to your account. I think they're billed quarterly through a transfer journal from Public Works.
How much is that
I don't know.
per chit?
$2.
$2?
9 and 10 will probably charge them.
Right.
Yeah, it depends, through you, Mr. Chair, it depends how long that the guest is here and when they leave the parking garage.
Okay, fair enough.
$3 to $10.
Councillor Vicente.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know at this committee in the past, I've asked the question, what exactly, in terms of numbers, are we talking about here? Are we talking about 5 letters, 500, 5,000? We still don't know. But before I ask that question directly to staff, I was wondering if we can get some insights into what it costs actually to mail a letter. Because I noticed that as a resident, I receive correspondence from the city all the time, whether it's my tax bill or an information mailing, or sometimes a very, very specific, a specifically sent letter, perhaps just to alert myself and residents on my street about, perhaps a construction delay that may be happening there. And I noticed that depending on the kind of mailing, it seems to be stamped differently. So for example, my tax bill has a pre-printed label, which obviously was printed at the same time that the envelope was produced. And interestingly, in the case of this bill, there is a return envelope that doesn't have any postage applied to it. Similarly, if, for payroll, I have an envelope that has a pre-printed postage paid number or account. Here, perhaps this may have been a more targeted mailing, more specific. So this was run from what I believe is a Pitney Bowes type machine, and the postage is 87 cents. If it was a letter that was stamped with a stamp, presumably the rate today for a stamp is $1.05. In this case, there is no return or return envelope. But my question is, we know we pay 87 cents here. What do we pay for this type of postage rate when there's a label with an account with Canada Post printed on the envelope? Do we know? Through you, Mr. Chair.
Through the chair, I'll attempt to answer that. So if the question is related to what do we charge for a prepaid return envelope, the answer is we don't do that. So we are not set up to be a bulk mail distribution company. My understanding is that anything that goes through our machine at City Hall is billed a stamp, period, end of story, and it's 87 cents or whatever the dollar is in terms of per weight. But we are not set up to do any sort of pre-billed return envelopes. So if anything goes through our machine, it's charged at that going rate, and what the person sending it out decides to do in terms of inserting it or not, whether that return envelope actually gets put in the mail or not, they have been charged for that cost of that stamp. The situation you're talking about there is oftentimes when there's a return envelope that comes through, the mechanism at Canada Post is such that depending on how many of those are actually put in the mail, the sender then gets billed based on the amount of return envelopes that have been put in the mail to come back. We're not set up to do that. So anything that goes through our machine is billed, is quantified like an odometer on your car. It's quantifying the number of envelopes that have gone through, and it's captured that way.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Through you, Chair, just a question then of clarification, if I may. So for a pre-printed envelope like this one that doesn't have a regular stamp on it or a Pitney Bowes fly-through label, we pay 87 cents to be able to mail this correspondence. So in the case perhaps of the tax bill, if we have 200,000 households, we're paying 87 cents times 200,000 pieces to mail that tax bill out?
If I may, through the chair, based on my previous experience handling survey mailouts, let's say, those type of envelopes that you presented to us where the postage is actually printed onto the envelope, those are considered more bulk mail, and you need to be able to, you need to be in a position to put out significant numbers, and for that you get a slight discount in postage. So instead of 87 cents, it may be 70 or 75 cents. What that number is, I don't know off the top of my head. I would have to follow up with finance and Canada Post to see what that number is, but it's typically not the 87 cents, it's slightly less, but it's not a significant difference.
Okay. My next question then is in an attempt to try to, for members of council to understand how many pieces of mail are we talking about here that have been sent out on behalf of members of council over the past several months since we provided direction for those numbers to be tracked? Do we have those numbers?
So through the chair, we have some numbers in regards to overall numbers that have gone through our City Hall mailroom, and I'll just give you order of magnitude. For the month of December, there was a total of 14,056 pieces of mail that went through our mailroom at City Hall for a total cost of $14,245. For the month of January, there was a total of 13,559 pieces of mail that went through our City Hall mail room for a total cost of $14,592. For the month of February, there was a total of 10,070 pieces of mail go through our City Hall mailroom for a total cost of $13,086. and $12. For the month of March, there was 10,873 pieces of mail through City Hall for a total cost of $11,646. Now, I will say that prior to March 22nd, there was no mechanism in place for us to start to track individual costs and things of that sort. So what I've given you is just bulk numbers in terms of the total volume of mail that had gone through our City Hall mail room.
Through you, Mr. Chair, so these numbers that you have provided, they would include all city mail that went through the city room? Do we know what the split is between mail sent by the council offices and the number sent by, say, the Works Department sending out a notice?
Through the chair, prior to March 22nd, no, we do not know any of the details. Following from March 22nd onwards, we've now established a process where we're able to track it, and we do have those individual details, yes.
Would we be able to know what those details are from March 22nd?
Through the chair, so I won't go through them all, but there was 12 items that were allocated out to strategic communications, 4 pieces of mail that went out from legal, 258 pieces of mail that went out from Public Works, 247 pieces that went out from the Building Department, 18 pieces of mail that went out from our Planning Department, 100 pieces of mail that went out from Recreation, 1,712 that went out from Finance, 13 that went out from Community Services in general, 20 that went out from our HR department, 894 that went out from Clerks, Bylaw, and Parking Enforcement, 104 that went out from Fire, 44 that went out from Transit, and then we had 16 out from Culture, and then we had 2 counselors that sent out some mail. We had 16 pieces that were allocated to yourself, Counselor, and we had 4,990 that were allocated to Counselor Williams. In total, and that's 10,873.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So I'd like to be heard. How come we didn't, when we brought this forward way back in March, we didn't track it then? When it went to member service, it went to committee, then we brought it back to member service, back and forth. And we never bothered. Now all of a sudden we got this number. Still, it's a high number, but still, it was a lot more done back then, and nobody knows.
Through the chair, as I said when we started, we're not set up to be a bulk mail distribution company. The moment that councillors started to talk about this, we started to put processes in place. We've refined the process as we're going along. We're striving to do our best to capture this. It's not something that we're typically set up to do. We've put the processes in place now. We're confident starting in April that we'll be able to do a better job of tracking it with some certainty. But we were not set up to do that. And it's you know, when you look at the overall numbers, it's not huge volumes, but at the end of the day, it's significant volumes, and it's something that, you know, this is a big organization, and it takes us some time to get those processes in place so that we can give you data with certainty.
Okay. So how are we gonna, so looking at this now, is this gonna be charged to our expenses, is that what you're saying, Peter?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, if committee were to consider this motion, the second one, and it were to carry through council, then on a quarterly basis, charges similar to the ones that the commissioner spoke of would be charged back to individual members' expense accounts.
In the past too, is that what you're saying? Or just now, as of now?
The motion that's on the screen is suggesting as of April 15th.
And what about in the past? Does it, we just let it go? It doesn't charge no one? So tomorrow morning on, because it's not the 15th, like we will mail 10,000 letters, you guys will be fine with that. That's what you're saying?
Through you, Mr. Chair, right now, I'm recommending as of April 15th. If committee wishes to change that date, that's committee's discretion.
I'm just saying, so tomorrow morning, I'd just like to go mail some letters, that's all, because it says the 15th, so I'm fine with it. Another one, on the printing costs, on the shared floor for the multifunctional printers, don't we have a scan card, so each one that wants to scan, they could scan and charge? What happens if I don't print anything, and I have to share the cost for all council? So I think each one should have we have a scan card, should mark it, no?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, there is scanning, so that can be
Yeah.
traced back to the individual member of council office.
Okay.
There, I believe, also it may be a component that relates to print paper, or just the general rental. Yeah. Expensed, yeah. So through you, Mr. Chair, if 500 is allocated as a potential expense and the councillor doesn't do any printing, then there'd be no charge.
You know, it's very unfair, because I like my agenda being printed, I'll be using more than Councilor Madero or Councilor Dillon. They have to pay for my expense, you know, I'm okay with it, but I don't think so they're okay with it. So,
So you would be, through you, Mr. Chair, you would be paying for it going forward and not other councillors.
that's fair enough. Councilor Santos?
Yes, so through you, Chair, so the code of conduct, and I'm trying to look at the piece where it's highlighted in my papers, but the code of conduct and the expense policy specifically says that expenses cannot be reimbursed through the city if it is for campaign purposes. It's strictly prohibited.
That's correct, and that's consistent with the Municipal Elections Act, which basically says that a municipality cannot make a contribution to a campaign.
Okay, so I was speaking to the Integrity Commissioner last week, and she was trying to walk this through with me, and maybe we could figure this out. So if you have a corporate letterhead, and on that letter, it made reference to a particular campaign website that was used in a campaign, is that considered campaigning?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think we're talking hypotheticals. If you're talking about a municipal election campaign,
Correct.
then potentially yes, without seeing the details, but potentially yes.
Okay. And then, so then what this does cover is expenses. So we now have a way of tracking mailing expenses, and the number of 5,000 letters in a 2-week period is concerning. How do we track and enforce the code of conduct side of things when it comes to content?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe the premise behind the council code of conduct is self-regulation by members of council. They all know the rules and they should be following the rules. And the purpose of the Integrity Commissioner is to help councillors navigate those rules. And where there is a complaint of a contravention, to do a proper investigation if warranted and report those findings to council. So there isn't an easy answer to that, but it is partly the responsibility of the individual members of council, and where necessary, the involvement of the Integrity Commissioner to help
Correct.
define those boundaries.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Mr. Cook. So because the code of conduct says that councillors are held to a higher standard, and when it comes to spending taxpayers' money, we should not be taking calculated risks as to finding loopholes in the code of conduct on where and when to spend. I am worried on the content side, so if you're saying that the only way to deal with contents of pieces of mail is through a complaint with an Integrity Commissioner, who would then conduct an investigation on mailings, which potentially is retroactive to the beginning of the term, if the Integrity Commissioner wanted to do that. Is that
For you, Mr. Chair, that is a possibility. Now, the Code of Conduct also speaks to informal resolution investigation before it gets into a formal investigation. So presumably those would be the avenues that an Integrity Commissioner may choose to take with a complaint that may come in to try and resolve a matter before it gets to a formal investigation,
Okay.
depending on the circumstances.
Great, because like you said, the only way to enforce the content is through self-regulation. is through us having integrity in our role as counselors to spend taxpayers' money as per what is outlined in the Code of Conduct. So on that case, I'm wondering, Chair, if I could ask a question to council colleagues, a very candid question, and I'll ask it to myself as well. Council colleagues, have you sent out any mailings? And if so, approximately how much since the beginning of your term in elected office? I'll start. I haven't sent any. Councillor Vicente? Oh, sir.
Councilor Gillen,
I have not sent any mail yet.
Councilor Vicente,
Through you, Clerk, I personally have not gone down to the mailroom to drop off any mail. But as per the discovery at the city, my office sent 16 pieces in March.
okay. Councilor Madero, sorry, Councilor Pelletier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Why are you asking the question?
Because sorry.
Councilor Santos, yeah.
Because the Code of Conduct and Expense Policy specifically says, as confirmed by the clerk, that in order to enforce the Code of Conduct, councillors are expected to behave at a higher level of standard. Not necessarily, the Code of Conduct does not exist to find loopholes in terms of spending, but we are held to a higher standard, and the only way to enforce that is through self-regulation or through a complaint with the Integrity Commissioner. And so I'm asking, as per self-regulation, my council colleagues how many mailings they have sent since the beginning of the term.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Fay. Mr. Fay, am I not allowed to send out anything to residents? Would that go against any kind of code of conduct here at the City of Brantford?
Through you, Mr. Chair, as I've said before to this committee, it's within the purview of an individual member in terms of how they communicate with their constituents, and through mailouts is one of the channels that's available.
So I'm allowed to do it. So then if I'm allowed to do something, then I ask again, why are you asking me the question?
You want to put me back? Because we have received, there are questions with respect to contents. Before you got here, I had questions about the contents of specific mailings as it applies to the Code of Conduct and the Expense Policy, where it clearly states that no campaigning is allowed, where it states that things such as magnets with the councillor's name on it are not allowed to be mailed out, etc. So there are some concerns that I have in terms of what was mailed out and whether or not it was in fact communication or whether it was campaign.
So then your question really relates to a whole lot of speculation, and the fact that in your line of questioning you've been able to wordsmith the opportunity or possibility that a member of council has done something that has not been allowed. And if any member of council was to do something to put forward or send anything out, I believe that they would have received the okay from not only the clerk's office, but you wouldn't, if a member of council asked to send something out, where would they go get that?
A member of council is a responsible elected official and will make that decision his or herself, fully informed, hopefully with the Code of Conduct. And the clerk's office does not vet communications by members of council.
So does it not go through communication? It has to go through somewhere. I can't physically just take stuff to the mailroom and just start sending stuff out.
Members of council can do that.
I can do that because it's allowed to do it? I'm allowed to do it?
Today, members of council are allowed to send mail out to whoever they choose. They're accountable at the end of the day for what they send out. But that's the right of the member.
And as of right now, nobody's broken any rules that you've seen.
I'm not going to comment on that because I'm not sure if we're talking hypotheticals or not, and it's not for me to comment on that.
No. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Maderos.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure, just regarding, I guess, your inquiry, Councillor Santos. I believe my assistant has confirmed that we've sent out 30 correspondence, primarily to schools.
Councillor Santos, yeah?
Thank you. Would other members of
Yeah,
council want?
I was gonna mention myself.
Oh, sorry, Councillor.
Yeah, through myself, I think I sent about 20 in total. I'm not 100% sure, between 18 and 25, I would say, in the last year and a half. Okay. Yeah. Carry on. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, through you, Chair, to the clerk. So if you could just clarify, there is no policy in place right now that prevents members of council from mailing their constituents on issues, especially issues related to topics being discussed at council meetings.
Through you, Mr. Chair, there is nothing that specific in terms of the logistics of sending material out. In terms of the content, if a member of council hypothetically were to send things out that were potentially contrary to the code of conduct, then that could be subject to a challenge.
Thank you, Clerk. So through you, we do have a formal process that we use to manage code of conduct issues, correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there's an informal process for resolving matters and a formal complaint process through the Integrity Commissioner if warranted.
Okay. And so is this the place for us to discuss code of conduct concerns, or is this where we discuss it?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the Governance and Council Operations Committee does have within its mandate sort of council operations, which would include the code of conduct. The specific nature of this particular item is on the council office transition, which is not directly related to the code of conduct, but does have some indirect linkages.
Okay. So I just have just a couple comments. I know that as elected officials, we are put in a position to make sure we're keeping our constituents informed and making sure our constituents are aware of what's happening at council. And especially with regards to topics being discussed, if we have no means of reaching out to them, especially since not every single person in Brampton uses social media or is online or even has internet access, we are limiting the amount of people that are going to be aware of what's going on in council. So, you know, mail-outs with regards to important issues, according to the policy, is allowed. And yeah, so I think, you know, having the conversation right now on how much mail has been sent out is, we are doing our job as councillors in order to send out the mail. And I know you said during, Commissioner, through you, Chair, to the Commissioner, you mentioned 4,990 letters were sent out. Did you say specifically who it was sent out from? Or was that overall?
Through the chair, from March 22nd onward, the mailroom had identified 4,990 pieces, identified as coming from your office, and 16 pieces coming from Councillor Vicente's office. The rest of it was through other areas of the city.
Okay, thank you.
Just to clarify, so I understand there's nothing in the policy about the mail. It's what I think we're talking two different things, is what we put in the mail. I remember years ago, I did some shirts and I put my name on it. Whatever comes out of my pocket is my pocket. There's nothing you can do about it. But when you're putting something in the mail and you're actually foreign with the letterhead and all, we're using actually taxpayers. So that's the difference. It's not about the mail. And I get that part. Right, so, Councillor Vicente.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to the content, just some of my thoughts. As Councillor Santos mentioned, friends of ours received some correspondence from Councillor Williams, and certainly Councillor Williams is entitled to her opinion at all times. But when you utilize city resources and taxpayer funds in order to campaign, I believe that the code of conduct does draw a very clear line in that case. And so I think that's important for everyone to understand.
Put your name on the board. Yes.
I'm concerned with the comments that Councilor Vicente just made about referring to me as campaigning. I don't think I was campaigning, and I just think if we're making those type of comments without having the backing from the Integrity Commissioner to determine whether or not actions were being done through campaigning or not, it can be damaging to members of council to make those type of comments. And I know we have a process, and I would encourage any members of council to use that process if they are concerned with the messaging, the content, everything, and have that process done first. And so that we're speaking from fact and speaking from a place where we have a report from the Integrity Commissioner or not.
Thank you. Councilor Vicente?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, Councilor Williams, I agree 100% with you. I agree that there is a process in place. And I think that that really is, as the clerk has said, really is an area for the Integrity Commissioner to make a decision. When we are, sending out materials that may not be in keeping with the code of conduct, or for example, are working within the community to ask the community to take one stand or another. We are certainly entitled, we have the opportunity, we have the right to speak our opinions in any which way we choose. But where we are using city resources in order to do that, the Integrity Commissioner does draw a line. And so I think that I'm just trying to add some context that is very important for us to recognize here. Some of us are experienced members of council, others are new. But if I were to, for example, through social media, say to followers there that I need you to help me convince the majority of city councilors to do this or to do that. I am using my own resources in order to achieve those goals. When we use city resources to do that, I think that that does go over the line. And so that, it really is a question for us to contemplate. And if the Integrity Commissioner is given an opportunity to consider these questions, certainly she will render a decision. Thank you.
Councilor Dillon?
Thank you. So, no, I do respect the right of, so I do respect the opinion of Councillor Williams. But I'm looking at the actual magnet itself. It does not say vote on it per se, but I don't think it's the best use of taxpayer money to be sending these out. And I'm assuming that...
Councilor Dillon, sorry. I must to cut you off. I know if we could file a complaint, that's fine.
I understand that.
So,
No, just generally speaking.
stick with this.
We're sticking with the topic that was being discussed by Councilor Vicente. So I wanted to know what the actual contents were. I saw it, but I had a couple of questions about this, and if I could ask the clerk, what is under the policy right now, can magnets be sent through mail?
Through you,
Or can I
Mr.
ask-
Chair, I'll start, and perhaps Finance may, because this is going to be addressed in our next item as well. The expense policy today says that, paraphrasing, that members cannot use their discretionary expense account to essentially produce something with their name on it, whether it's pens, lawn signs. It used to be specific to actually itemized list, magnets, fridge magnets. but that is an ineligible expense under today's council expense policy. It doesn't identify magnets by verbatim in the policy, but the implication is it's anything with a name on it. So it could be T-shirts, it could be anything.
Right, so
Because it's
respectfully,
self-promotion.
if I can ask through the chair to Councilor Williams, was this, were these magnets purchased through any city funds, or was it personal funds only? If-
Jillian, personal funds only, and when I realized that we have business cards, and our business cards have our city contact information on it, and so does that, and and we are allowed to change the business cards to reflect the way we want them to look, and, also, the magnetized business cards don't have to be replaced as often, so taking consideration to spending, we're not replacing something like that as
Right.
often. So having my constituents have something that they can use to get a
Right.
hold of me,
So to the chair, if I may, yeah, if the business cards are expensed through our discretionary fund, so would you have considered, if you consider this a business card, charging it to the discretionary fund? Like, why did you pay, if you feel this is a business card, why did you choose to? I think we're on subject. Why did you choose to pay for it out of your own pocket?
it was made, after the purchase was made, it was brought to my attention that this wasn't allowed. So we covered it personally. Like I said, I think we should be, is this Integrity Commissioner territory for these questionings? Because, I have contacted the Integrity Commissioner as well, and prior to sending this, we did attempt to reach the Integrity Commissioner as well, before we had the new Integrity
But what I'm saying is
Commissioner,
though,
to verify
just to
whether it
finish
was
off
allowed
this
or not.
point,
So,
just through the chair,
I think that,
just to finish the point off, you had just said that it was a business card, but then you were informed that it wasn't a business card, and so, right, and I will conclude by this, Mr. Chair, saying that we have, every cent we use is the taxpayers' money. And we have to use it responsibly, and I personally don't think this was a responsible use of our taxpayer money by sending these cards out. It could be confused for campaigning, and so we do have our newsletters that are sent out quarterly or twice a year, biannually, and so I think those are the appropriate channels we should use to be getting any information out that we need to as councillors to our constituents directly. And so I will say this, and I respect, I guess, your intentions to engage your constituents, but I don't think this is the right route or outlet that we use to do that.
Thank you. Councilor Maderos.
Thank you, through the chair. Al, you had mentioned that you gave us a number of what, since you put in this new process, do you roughly have the value of what that would have been? So if there was, I don't know, 4,000 letters, how much would that cost the city?
Through the chair, are you specifically asking about the 4,990 pieces?
So what would the cost of that be?
The cost for that was $5,520.75.
Oh, so $5,500. And so that is a corporate expense. And I guess through the chair to Peter, the intent, I guess, of our mail, and I guess this is a different scenario because the previous 4 years, I know that Councilor Fortin and myself, because of sending out mail for Christmas, as you know, we're Catholics and we Christians, and we want to, we were asked to pay that back. That was an ineligible expense. So that was, I guess, the logic of that council, because it wasn't a corporate message. So the interpretation of that expense policy back then, was it just simply a motion that they said no Christmas letters, because that was a form of communication? Or was the rationale because it didn't go, or it wasn't withstanding the policy at the time, it didn't adhere to the policy?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe the policy probably was silent, And I think it was a factor of a number of things, the number of cards that went out, and the potential, and the cost involved. So I think subsequently, there was a resolution of council passed to effectively ban Christmas cards on a go-forward basis.
Yeah, and and through the chair, the logic, as you explained, so it was retroactive, I believe, at the time, the decision back then. Is that correct?
I would have to go back and look at the resolution. I remember, I don't know if it was, but I can go back and
Sure.
check.
So I think the big question here, we just went through budget. If we were to do roughly with one counselor spent, I don't know, $5,000, and each counselor took that liberty, basically we've spent around $50,000, where we're looking for savings for seniors and we're looking for a reduced bus fare. You know, $50,000 in the organization would go extremely far. So, and we're just talking about lowballing it, and we're just talking about one counselor. If we did 5 times 11, so we're looking at 60,000, and this is just mail out. And it's one thing when it's a corporate message, and I don't know if any process would adhere to after. But I do think this is a bigger issue than just simply the communication, if that's a form of communication. But, you know, that's why I guess in the next presentation, you'll be addressing this in the expense policy, because now going forward, this would be charged to your account. And this way, each counselor could take that responsibility on for it. But I just think this was, again, if this was the first time we're discussing it, I'd say, okay, you know, this is, but I think this was a form of communication which cost us considerably. And here we are having to deal with it again. And it's just difficult because, again, it's not just the 5,000, it's the 5,000 times 11. It's basically, we're looking at a huge expense when, you know, we come in at a zero, we have some good news stories, and this is an action, I think, that just merits and warrants more attention, and it's not exactly the message we want to send to our community. And again, I guess the content would speak to it, but it is difficult when we have our own newsletters and we have a considerable expense towards our newsletters. Thank you.
Thank you. Last time, Councillor Santos, and then we have to move on.
I'm sorry. Somebody move a motion. Just a quick question. I recall back in January, at a committee of council meeting, we added the mailing issue, councilors' mailing issue to the agenda. I believe that was the first time we started talking about this in January. How many times have we brought this mailing issue as a concern to the public? That includes committee of council, council meetings, governance relations meetings, etc.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe it's 3 times, 4 including today. So at the February 12th Governance and Council Operations Committee meeting, this matter was introduced. The matter was subsequently introduced in a committee of council meeting after February 12th. I don't know the precise date. There was a small debate at committee of council, and then the matter was referred back to the Governance and Council Operations Committee and was discussed at the February 25th meeting, the last meeting of this committee, and now today.
Okay, so, you know, as a team on council working together, when your council colleagues, and potentially, you know, I'll just leave it at council colleagues. When your council colleagues are expressing concern around the spending you are doing on mailings, like if Paleshi said to me, hey, Ro, can you please stop the mailings? It's costing a lot of money, don't know what's in there. Your council colleagues and the rest of the team don't feel comfortable with it. Can you just stop? After probably the first time somebody would share that with me, as per the code of conduct and being held to a higher standard where no individual counselor is treated differently from other individual counselors, I would stop. And what we hear, as per what Councillor Medeiros has pointed out, why we're here again today discussing this issue again at length, is because only until April the 2nd did a particular counselor stop the mailings. And this is what is incredibly frustrating at this point, because what is the point of having a code of conduct? What is the point in having public meetings and warning our council colleagues to please be more responsible with taxpayers' money over and over and over again if they're going to continue doing it? So I just wanted to add that comment, and I'm hoping, because March 22nd was when the staff was able, because they've never had to deal with this before, has been able to track the mailings from the councillor offices. Within 2 weeks of that tracking, from March the 22nd, a councillor sent out 5,000 mailings to include magnets. At this point, without the Integrity Commissioner's help, we don't know retroactively what those other mailings are about. So I'm now being cut off by the chair. Okay.
Yeah, I think, so I'm gonna be here. So Peter, I remember when me, Councilor Palashi, Maderos got elected, we sent out Christmas cards. And I remember we didn't have a dad, and they asked us how many do you want, and I got 4,000 cards printed. I sent, I think, around 700, because that's all the contacts I had back then. I put a card inside, and they charged us $4,000, 4,000 stamps, even though I never mailed them, because that's what we ordered. Remember back then? And because we got sworn in December 1st. So maybe, I did say let's put a stop to it when we had last member services. We went back and forth, so this expense, to get it over with, because we have this coming up on the 15th, because we're gonna carry on this mailing over and over and over. How could we recuperate this spot? We have that 6,000 something expense, take it off the expense, and it's forgotten, and everything's over. Think that would be okay? Or else this is gonna carry on forever, and we can't sit here every member service, every member just talking about mailing. I tried to do it last time, just put a freeze on until the 15th, but we all carried on, so.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's up to committee if they wish to, a member wishes to introduce a motion and debate it as the motions, possible motions that are on the screen, or some other motion. That's up to committee.
Okay, well, I don't know exactly what I sent. I know I must have sent between 20 and 30 here and there, but I didn't exceed that much. So Councilor Vincenti sent out some mail, and he said he didn't send anybody. Shows 16, that's fine. It should be charged for. Whatever we sent out, I think we should just pay for it. And as of the 15 on, it comes on our budget again, and we just gotta watch for what we're putting in the mail. You know, we shouldn't be campaigning on taxpayers' money. And I remember I did T-shirts, I had to throw them out in the mail and stuff, and I had to get rid of it. So maybe we'll just go back and we'll just put it on our expense. Huh? Yeah. So, everybody's okay with that in the committee? Councilor Vicente?
Mr. Chair, for clarification, are you placing a motion on the floor? And what is the motion?
We just pay, I think, since we have that budget and it's over for this year, we have it left over, the 6,000, we'll maybe just take it out of that budget there and recuperate the cost, because we started this new one on the 15th anyway. So it's really not affecting anyone at this time.
So through you, Mr. Chair, then are you suggesting that there be a third motion that for any expenses, mailing expenses incurred since March 22nd, if that's the date for which we have
Well,
accurate data capture, that those expenses be charged back to the member's account?
well, we have the 6,250, which we really probably roll a couple of checks here and there to charity. We have that, so we could take it out of that, because from now on, as of the 15th, which is next week, we're going into the new budget. So instead of sending this back, we can just take it out of this budget here.
So through you, Mr. Chair, I just want to clarify, the new budget is the 4,300 that gets added to the 6,250. That is discretionary funds that each member of council has available to do mailings, and it would get charged back to that account.
So we cannot recuperate this expense, is that what we're saying?
Through you, Mr. Chair, if that's a motion that committee wishes to put forward, that's the committee's jurisdiction.
Well, I'd like to recuperate the expense. I just don't want it coming out of anyone's pocket, like I have to do. You know, but if we have it here, we just start off with a shorter budget for a bit. That's all, to recuperate it. That's what I'm trying to say.
So through you, Mr. Chair, then is a member, yourself, going to introduce a motion then that, that any mail expenses, or the mail expenses for those two members that were identified be, those expenses be recouped from their business discretionary expense account for 2019.
Okay with that, Council? You guys okay? Or what do you want? Okay, that's fine. And then as of the 15th, it just starts off with, I'm fine with it. Okay, thank you.
So is there a motion?
Point of clarification, does that new, does the new budget start over, or
Starts
is it
over.
carried on?
No.
So through you, Mr. Chair, as of January 1st this year and ratified through the budget on March 27th, each member of council has $6,250 discretionary spending account, plus they're getting an additional $4,300, what we think are itemized for those things, but the $10,000 and change in total is available at the member's discretion to spend in 2019.
So it'll start over again next year.
It will start over again
And it
next year
doesn't-
with whatever the number is the
And I
council
think what
approves through
she's
the
trying to-
2020
And it
budget.
doesn't touch the budget for the 2000, after the 15th, it won't touch that budget. Has nothing to do with that one.
Next year,
No, but it's not gonna touch your budgets for your expenses, for your hiring. No, that's what it is.
So through the chair, any amount incurred in 2019 will be captured against the 10,333. So it doesn't reset at April 15, it reset at the start of the budget cycle, so January 1st, 2019.
I understand that, but it won't affect the budget as we're, the hiring budget. I wanted, that's what I'm trying to say.
No, it's
Okay,
just the
that-
discretionary.
Then I'm
piece,
fine
basically.
with the motion I put down on the floor, yeah. So long as it doesn't affect that budget, or it can be taken out, that's fine. I want someone starting with a less budget, that's what I'm trying to say. So that's the motion I have on the floor, okay. Yeah, Councilor Williams.
So, just for clarification, if we have here on this slide that outlines, where's that budget slide? Okay, that outlines the $4,300. So if the discretionary budget is going to be used to retroactively pay back the $5,500 or however many, that means money is allocated for staff development, for mileage, office expenses, possibly the smartphone and printer lease and such will not be available. Is that correct?
No.
Through you, Mr. Chair, as I've said, those are estimates of how to allocate out those funds, and I think Councillor Dillon had asked a question earlier. The $10,300 is completely at the member's discretion how they wish to expense that. So if this motion were to carry, and there were expenses that would be incurred, they'd be charged against that $10,300. And whatever's left is a reduced amount of money for the councillor to spend on everything else that he or she wishes to spend money on in the year.
Okay, so that, through you, Chair, so the money would be left for the counselor to operate as a counselor for the remainder of the year.
Correct.
With a significantly smaller budget, even though there was no policy in the past to regulate whether or not we could do mailings of mass amounts or not.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct if this motion were to carry through council.
Okay, so this motion is directly preventing a counselor for carrying out their counselor duties with a significant deficit, I guess, or less than what the other members of councilors have to conduct their council expectations and such.
I'm gonna speak to the motion again. I don't know. We've been going back and forth with this since 2 months ago when I said to stop it. It was spent, so, or we take it out from the 6,200, so she will not lose the 2,000 smartphone. I don't want it to start with something different in us, because we have 6,200. Or we could take it out of the budget that we have in total, the 200,000, one or the other. That's all I'm saying.
Through you, Mr. Chair, if this
It's
motion
all one account, so
were to
we have
carry,
the
it would be subtracted from the affected councillor's expense account.
Okay, so that's fine. Okay, thank you. So,
I'm just to be clear, it's subtracted from the council's expense account, even though there was no policy in the past that said that a council member could not mail out to their constituents. Because the budget that was being used to, for mailings was a part of the larger corporate mailing and printing budget. Is that right?
Through you, Mr. Chair, this motion would retroactively charge to, at least that we're aware of, 2 members of council expense accounts.
Councillor
So
Santos.
it's not a really, it's,
Go
I'm
ahead,
still
sorry.
on the board.
I didn't see you. Okay, I let you speak. I didn't see you. Go ahead.
I'm just trying to get clarification. It's not an even playing field for moving forward, but that's fair, you know. It's the will of council, and I'll accept
Well,
what
you know,
that will of
I'm
council
gonna stop you
says.
there. It's not about playing field. We were going back and forth
Playing
since April. Let's put a stop to it. And it was ignored. And you just did this 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago again. And if we didn't have this coming up on the 15th, this would have carried on. So
Point of order.
I had to pay 4,000 out of my pocket, so did Councilor Maderos and all of our pocket at the time. We were honest, making an honest mistake, but we stopped. We didn't carry on. Councilor Santos.
Thank you, through you, Chair. We, although it was not
It's the last
outlined
time, yeah.
specifically on the policy and procedure for the corporate mailing process, specifically as worded, thou shalt not, et cetera, the code of conduct, because I asked the Integrity Commissioner this question, the code of conduct says that councillors are held to a higher standard, that individual councillors are not to be treated any differently.
Councilor Santos, can we deal with the 30?
Yes. Okay, one final thing. Sorry.
Or else we're gonna go on this all.
One final thing. This motion is consistent with the code of conduct in that we have to be held accountable, we have to be transparent, and I will add that all of the councillors, perhaps with the exception of one, has shared how many mailings we have mailed for the entire duration of the term.
Point of order.
Okay, guys, I'm gonna cut everyone off.
Okay.
That's it.
Point of order
Councilor,
to the chair.
Councilor Dillon,
Okay,
no more.
Thank you.
thank you.
Go ahead.
So just in relation to the motion, I think it's relevant that I add one example as well during the last, which I hadn't mentioned, the last term of council. Just speaking to correspondence and reaching out to a councillor's constituents, there was a business that delivers their products to a number of different homes within the ward, and what they did was they said, they approached me, and they approached, I think it's the MPP and the MP, who also signed up, that whenever they delivered their product, they also have a community, like a community portion of whatever their packaging was. So if I wanted to relay any messages to my constituents, and mistakes happen, and I signed up for it. It cost $1,000. I think it was for like a year or two, but I was notified by staff after I wasn't able to do it, and so I immediately paid the money back myself. So I did attempt to reach out to my constituents. Staff informed me it was not the correct manner, and so I thought that would be just similar to what Councillor Fortini and Maderos had to do. They had to pay it back. I think this is a relevant example as well.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Maderos, last speaker on the board, that's it.
Just lastly, through the chair.
Speaking to the motion.
Again, first of all, Councillor Fortini does a responsible thing by putting this motion forward. We can't, as much as, and it's not about individuals, it's not about if we like or not like, but clearly there was a history over the last 8 to 10 years. We heard of abusive expense policies, why Brampton's always had a tradition, or since I've been elected, of having more restrictive expense policy account than other municipalities. Essentially what this says is that we are providing here leadership as board of directors. We also, and I think what Councillor Fortini does here is actually being very mindful and supportive of any councillors who may have spent more than they imagined, because you're allowing to be recouped from an account going forward instead of having to go into your personal funds. I think there's a recognition that we're changing policy, but we can't put our hands in the sand and pretend that this is not an expense that would outrage my residents. If I heard residents, if I was to tell them that I spent $5,000 on, again, the content is up to the person, but basically, talking about one issue, I think, residents would be irate. So I think we've, unfortunately, Councilor Fortini has taken the leadership here, is put in a difficult situation as the chair of this committee, and decided to show some leadership and respect taxpayers' dollars. So thank you, Councilor Fortini, for putting this, and I hope every councillor sees this as an opportunity to move forward, and a willingness to all work together, but ultimately respecting the taxpayer. Thank you.
So, all in favor of that motion then?
Recorded vote, please.
Yeah. For vote, Stan?
A recorded vote has been requested. Would all those voting members of the committee in favor of the motion please stand? I have Councillor Vicente, Councillor Medeiros, Councillor Fortini, and Councillor Dillon. Would all those opposed please stand? I have Councillor Williams. The motion carries 4-1.
Can I just clarify something back to this? No, about I think I sent about 55 letters, and it said Big Brother, Big Sister edition. So I don't know if that's part of that too. I sent on the mailing, there was extra on the Big Brother, Big Sister, so I don't know if there was part of that. It was 55 letters sent out. So if that's part of it, you have to add it to my expense.
Is that before March 22nd or after?
No, actually, we had the bowling, so it was before, just around that.
So if it was before, we weren't tracking it before.
Okay. Okay, let's go to the next slide, sorry, Peter. So we're at 6.2 now? Okay. Oh, yeah.
So, just in terms of, and there are some motions that are in the slide that the committee needs to consider going forward. In terms of City Clerk's Office support and assistance, as we go through this new transition model starting next Monday, your role will now be as a supervisor as well as an office manager. So the clerk's office will still be available to provide advice and linkages to other corporate supports throughout the organization. And supplies ordering, as I mentioned, will still be through the council office assistant. Time entry review and sign-off will be managed through the clerk's office, but there will be some sign-offs that you will be responsible for. And also, which is not on here, performance management. We'll be moving forward with that for those staff that are impacted by that. In terms of training for counselors, there's a training session that we are planning for May 14th, the nuts and bolts of managing others for people leaders, that will cover a number of topics. Members of council may recall that there was a respectful workplace training back in January, and we also are scheduling health and safety and what I would call sort of the orders, forms, and sign-offs training for the day-to-day approvals that you have to do as now office managers and supervisors. And that will go over things like budgeting, expense tracking, work orders, tickets, service and supply orders, and vacation approvals, timesheets, and overtime. Finally, in terms of next steps, future Governance Council Operation Committee meetings will monitor implementation because you are the steering committee for this new model. What's working, what needs attention as we move through the next several months. And we'll be monitoring to 2019 expenditures to inform 2020 budget implications and any other implementation matters that come up. And Mr. Chair, that is it for my presentation. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But there are some motions that are in this slide deck, 3 in particular, 2 on this slide and 1 on the slide, 2 slides before that the committee should turn its mind to.
I think you got it. Councilor Vicente, a couple of questions.
So we're still on 6.1 then. So I would be happy to move for receipts of the presentation by the clerk and the motions or recommendations inside.
Thank you.
As
And
amended.
I want to ask a couple of questions. So Peter, I know we had a conflict on who we're hiring. How far does it go as family members? I remember I asked that last time.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would have to pull up the policy on hiring relatives, but I believe it is at least direct relatives. And I can't tell you definitively, I don't have the policy at my fingertips, but I can find that out.
Thank you. So, you have to pass a motion for this, Paul? Right?
Councillor Vicente has moved the three recommendations that are in the presentation.
That's carried, thank you. So, we're gonna move on to, another present, 6.2, expense policy. Did you guys want to move this for next time? This is a lot to read. So, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll just take the next few minutes to provide a brief update on the changes to the council expense policy. Just a track changes version of the policy was provided with the agenda today that actually highlights some of the key changes. And the changes are being driven as a result of the staffing option change effective April 15th. In terms of just a bit of background about the policy itself, so significant updates to the policy were made back in 2018 in line with our overall new corporate policy framework. Changes made to the document also took into account findings from the KPMG audit of members of council expenses from 2017, as well as feedback from internal audit and their comments. We also conducted a benchmarking exercise with respect to the actual policy content back in 2018 and held meetings with members of council to incorporate feedback into the updated document. And that policy was approved by council in 2018, effective December 1st, 2018. Given the changes to the council support model, we have updated the policy document to now include council staff in the scope of the policy. The approval process for expenses incurred by council staff has also been updated. The remuneration and reporting of members of council expenses has also been updated to reflect that the salaries and benefits of council staff as well as their expenses will be included as part of the expense reporting for each member of council. Updates to the standard technology package and the standard office equipment and furniture asset package have also been made to reflect changes in the council support model. One additional, I think, comment that Councillor Dillon had with respect to the P-card process. So the P-card is available to members of council staff should they elect to choose it. I believe in the past, council members themselves haven't held P-cards, but staff have. So as part of the new P-card policy or the new P-card program rollout, it is mandatory for a P-card holder to have training and their P-card approver to have training as well, but they can hold a P-card. That was it from my perspective. Any questions on the actual policy?
Thank you through the chair. Thank you for the presentation. And escaped me when I was looking at regarding our sponsorships, community groups, etc., religious groups. I know that was not included before. Do we have that discretion now to support faith-based organizations? So I give the example of, for example, there's a singers organization that belongs to my church, and previously I could not help them with their activities. Is this permitted now?
Through the chair, I believe it was previously included as well. We didn't actually make a change to the definition of the organizations for community sponsorship.
My understanding from, again, I don't know if this is maybe a communication with staff,
Right.
that any faith-based organizations, such as a church, etc., we were not allowed to give any sponsorship. So I don't need an answer now, but can you just confirm? So as of my understanding, then if I want to support a church activity based on what they're doing, I can provide that sponsorship.
So through the chair, the policy specifically states that donation or sponsorship to religious organizations is ineligible unless it is for a community event fundraiser.
Well, and I guess through the chair, I guess interpretation and challenge I had with staff. So for example, a youth group within the church wants to put on, I don't know, a drama thing. And they came to me looking for some sponsorship so they can help buy props and stuff like that. So conversations with staff at the time, anything that was sort of faith-based group, they basically said, you know, there's no community benefit. So I give you an example. Belonging to a Portuguese church here in Brampton, the broad community impact is very limited because it's really targeted to the Portuguese church. So the interpretation of it is to me the frustration, and so the community impact is always relative because it's usually those people attending that faith-based organization. And so what would the impact be for the city of Brampton? It's almost like it's very limited. So how can we, so that's where I have an issue with, because I guess the broad definition, very rarely will you see faith-based activity that impacts the broader community. Any comments on that, or?
I think through the chair, when we did the one-on-one meetings with council, I think that was one feedback that we kind of took into account. But the consistent feedback was as long as it is being reported under kind of my specific, against my council specific budget, let me kind of incur it. But I think there is room for interpretation there, but I think we have to kind of treat it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, now if I want to make an amendment to allow for councilors' discretion regarding faith-based organizations, can you propose some language?
Sure.
How we can make that a little bit more clearer, so if any of us want to support faith-based organization?
Through the chair, absolutely. We can take that back.
Okay, and I guess the clerk, if you, maybe, I'm not sure when you can craft this, or if you want to bring this up to council next week, or? Would that be better for you?
That's fair.
Okay, that's fair then.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So in regard to the P card.
Yes.
Last term of council, I took a P card. It was given directly to me. It wasn't given directly to staff, my staff. But I didn't receive any training for it. And I think it will be beneficial to have some training given to myself or council to staff members as well, because as I mentioned in the earlier example I gave, where I had thought I was under the impression I was, making this expense to reach out to my constituents. I was told otherwise, and so I think it's really, it will be valuable for us to get that information to make sure that we're using it wisely. So, next question is though, in terms of the P cards itself. Will that option be given to all of the councilors as to whether they want to have it or not, or will it automatically be given to their offices?
Through the chair, I believe it will be an option given to all council.
Yeah, through the chair. We'll provide the training. We've got a whole new P card program anyway. It's not manual anymore. It's done electronically. So it's all the invoices are scanned, and it's completely different now. And we'd have to provide the training to your staff.
Is there for the P card in just related to the actual discretionary fund, is there real time we can see where we are at and how much we've spent and how much is left?
Through the chair, it's not real time. I think with the automation of the whole P card process, it's gotten much faster. So whereas previously when we were doing manual P card reconciliations, it might have taken almost between 6 to 8 weeks between incurring the expense and actually showing up in the accounting. I'd say the turnaround time is now much faster. So I'd say between 2 to 3 weeks, it's actually showing up against your actual. So it's not still real time. There is a little bit of a lag between the reconciliation process and when accounting actually updates the records and it shows up on the actual expense.
And so for the, is there like a form, every expense that is being filled out by the councillor?
Through the chair, with the new P card process, it's all become automated. So it's all, you incur the expense, you attach the invoice, and you submit it to your approver. It's become all online now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Can the chair be heard? Just a couple of quick. So on the P card, we don't have to all have it. It's our choice, am I correct?
Sorry?
The P card, it's our choice if we want to add up the card. We don't have to take it if we don't want.
No, it's usually the councilor's assistants that would have the card.
My second question is, I remember on Councilor Madero's on the faith and stuff, like If it's we had that, if it belongs something with the community, we're allowed to give. Like I give to Lucas Carnival, it's part of the community. So how come we couldn't give if it's part of the community?
Through the chair, I'm not 100% sure of the specific circumstances there, but even the current policy, the way it reads is donations or sponsorships to religious organizations, unless it is for a Brampton community event or fundraiser, are ineligible. So I think there are, to the councillor's point, some just clarity around what that community event fundraiser is. Maybe having a little bit more defined term there might help bring some clarity to that.
Because Knightsbridge and Lucas Carnival belong to them, and I always donate it, no problem. It's part of the community. Okay, thank you. So then you.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, just for clarity. So I think you're receiving the presentation, you're updating, approving the updated expense policy, and then requesting staff to report back on the matter of religious organizations.
All in favor? And 8.1, discussion of the 6-4 access use, city access cards.
Through you, Mr. Chair, so perhaps I'll start. We just put this on here just to, one, get some feedback, initial feedback from members of council on, since the implementation of the secure access to the 6th floor, and then also, after any questions or feedback that we hear from members of council, discuss a few issues that have come up from the staff perspective that we'd like to raise with you just as reminders.
It's a verbal update.
Yeah, just a verbal? Is that it?
Yes.
Okay. Councilor Maderos.
Are you going to provide the verbal update?
I can start. It was more just to get feedback from members
okay.
since we've implemented this 3 weeks ago, I believe.
Through the chair, thank you, Peter. I've noticed a considerable improvement. I guess the one interesting thing now is, for example, where councillors' discretion is when we receive guests or when we receive people and how they flow through the office without, it's one thing to be a guest and visit us. It's another thing to roam around our office space and get access to our stuff that we have, and that's a concern. And as we add more people, so assuming that some may have one or two, we're gonna have more bodies there. So when a guest comes to visit me, my responsibility of, I take in that 1 hour meeting, and then I escort them on the premises. And what I've noticed sometimes is that, and it's happened even with myself, where we bring guests, and as they're leaving, all of a sudden they meet another counselor, and then they start roaming around, and they're still there for a couple of hours. So I don't know, I guess, again, not to get the corporation involved, but there reaches that sort of, everyone has to have that respectful environment, and they have, our offices, but beyond the offices, it's a shared workspace. And I've noticed a shared workspace sometimes is not being respected, and how we maintain that and control that is difficult, but I do appreciate the process is a lot better. We're not having people hanging around there, and people come in for business and go. And I thank you for all that, but I guess what I raise is just more about each councillor sort of being mindful and respectful of the environment in which we're working within, and especially considering we'll be having 2 more people there. So there's not much I would imagine the city can do that, but thank you very much.
Councilor Vicente.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I'll just add my impressions as well. I do agree with Councillor Maderos that it has been working better since the system changed. One observation that I do have, and this is based on comments from one of our guests, is that if you're not familiar with the layout of City Hall and you arrive in the foyer area, it is not immediately apparent which counter you should be approaching. And we do inform them to approach the customer service desk or the 311 desk. But it's interesting because it's not labeled that way in the foyer of City Hall. And there's also planters and greenery that is positioned in such a way that it blocks the signage of the customer service or 311 access points. So perhaps some better wayfinding or signage for that for the customer service area might help in that regard, so that when we provide direction to our guests, there is a direct correlation to what they see visually when they enter the foyer. Aside from that, I applaud the move. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Williams?
Thank you. Through you, Chair, to the clerk. When, moving forward after the 15th, will there still be somebody at the desk where Valerie is? She will still be there?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes. Valerie is a full-time person dedicated to assisting with the council office floor.
Okay. So the process of which people call up, they call up to Valerie, and then Valerie informs us.
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, in fact, the process is when they check in at Service Brampton downstairs, Service Brampton representatives will call up to the councillor's specific office, and it's the responsibility of the councillor or his or her staff to come down to greet the guest and bring them upstairs.
Okay, because that's the area that I have, we've had some misses with, because if I'm not in by my desk, or, you know, if we're not by the phone, the calls get missed, and our people are just kind of sitting downstairs. So I'm wondering if there's some way to have Valerie be able to receive that call, or something to help kind of sort that piece out, because if we're not right by our phone, then we're not going to know.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think the expectation was at the beginning with additional staff for each councillor that there would be enough hands to help.
Right.
The challenge is with using Valerie, that position, a council office assistant, is there will be 11 requests made of her, and all of those requests cannot be fulfilled.
Okay.
And in fact, one of her roles is to make sure that people coming in, you know, she's opening the glass doors for them if she sees it's somebody who's a familiar face, or greeting somebody.
Right, okay.
So she does fulfill an important role being
Yeah,
stationed
okay,
there, and
she
if she's
does.
not there, there is some additional potential risks.
Right,
But it is something we can consider as we monitor this over the coming months.
Okay. Yeah, so you're saying if she was to get up and go get each counselor, if somebody was coming in, yeah, that would leave a gap there at that desk in that event. Okay,
Make her use the stairs. You do it. Almost wait.
okay. All right, thank you. Thanks.
Councillor Dillon?
Thank you. So I just want to make comment that I think now that the fact is restricted access has produced a lot of the walk-ups, and there was a lot of confusion before where, and I had mentioned that, you know, somebody's there to see, who will come up and say, I'm here to see the mayor. You don't know, but you let them in anyways. I think that's been reduced significantly. So I think that's going well. And just as to what Councilor Vicente mentioned, for a person coming new to City Hall, you know, I've seen in some buildings where they have those poles, and it'll kind of guide you in which way to go. 311 is this way, or pay your bills this way, with a little arrow on it. So maybe that might be helpful, or we, you know, just write customer service or customer service desk where currently Service Brampton is. And so just to make it easy for people, because I've also heard that people get lost as well. And so maybe one will point towards the conservatory, one will point towards the elevators, or whatever it may be, but it might be helpful.
Thank you. Just through myself, just a couple of questions for you. So Val in the front will still stay there, right?
That's correct
Okay,
at this
that'll be
point,
fine.
yes.
And I understand it's hard for her to go up and down because 11 councillors and all, but we're not going to use it to do our work as we're hiring more people. That's one thing.
That's correct, through you, Mr. Chair. It's, she'll be assisting with orders, being a greeter, but she will not be providing backup services to the 10 members of council, as she has in the past.
Okay, and my next question is, so going back that we can't bring people up and down, we also have to make that clear for the new people coming in to work with us, the same thing. So it's not, if we're
That will
not
be
there,
part of
they're
the
gonna start
onboarding.
bringing people, and they gotta make sure they bring them down. Okay.
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the comments. This is good feedback, but there are a few matters that, as staff, I think we need to raise with the committee since we've implemented this. And the first I wanted to raise, and the reason I'm raising these is because the security and well-being of the sixth floor occupants, but whether it's members of council, staff, the mayor's office, or visitors, is paramount, is From the corporate perspective, we have noticed that there have been members of council who have loaned their passes to other people who are not city employees and are guests for access to the sixth floor, which is not appropriate. We've reminded those individual members. We will continue to remind those members. But that poses a risk for everybody on the sixth floor. The second thing is there are council office staff that have been guilty of the same thing, and we have had discussions with them as well, and we will continue to have discussions with them through you as of April 15th, because they'll be your staff. But again, it poses a risk. And finally, what we've observed recently is it appears to be that there may be some visitors coming up to the sixth floor that are bypassing Service Brampton, taking the public elevator to the fifth floor, then taking the stairs up to the sixth floor, calling for somebody on the sixth floor to let them in on the floor. So they're not being registered. So I'm just reminding all members of council, that defeats the purpose of having secure access, which council requested, to ensure that we make sure the right people are on the floor. And to Councillor Medeiros' point, if a member of the public is coming up to meet a councillor, that councillor and that staff for that councillor is responsible for that person. And if there is a handoff to another councillor, they need to make sure that that receiving councillor then becomes responsible for that person leaving the floor. It's everybody's responsibility to ensure that security is maintained on that floor.
So Peter, to one of your question, we cannot close that door on the sixth floor? When the
Through you,
stairs
Mr. Chair,
are?
we can't. It's a fire exit, first of all. And it is secure access pass activated at this point, so it's not open.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay. Councilor Vicente.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the clerk, these are valuable points. Not all members of council are here in this committee. Will this information be provided once again when all members are present?
It can, and through you, Mr. Chair, I actually have on my to-do list to send something out to all members of council to remind them of this.
Okay. So, we have to receive the report. Okay. All in favor? Passes, thank you. And we have one more 8.2 on the social media accounts.
Through you, Mr. Chair, this is just a discussion item that I'll raise that I think a few members have asked about links to their social media accounts. And you may recall at the beginning of the term, the model that we were working towards was corporate social media accounts, whether it's Twitter or Facebook. But what we're hearing from members of council is you have a lot more followers on your personal email accounts. So there are models out there, and our proposal is to follow a similar model that literally a linkage would be provided on your web page, for example, that would say if you wish to follow the councillor, you can go to their Twitter account here, their Facebook, their Instagram account. But there would be a disclaimer that they are leaving the municipality, the municipal's website, and the city is not responsible for things that happen in those personal social media accounts. So I just want to make sure you're aware of that. And but by saying that, I also want to reinforce with you that as elected officials, you are still responsible for how you conduct yourself in the social media world, and you may be held accountable for that with the Integrity Commissioner, with the Code of Conduct, so please be mindful of that you don't have the freedom of being another person outside the city, and you can do and say what you want on social media. So just be mindful of that, please.
Councilor Vicente.
Mr. Through you, Chair, to the clerk, so that is very interesting. I'm not surprised to hear you say that. Can you expand on that a little bit more in terms of our responsibility when we're commenting on social media?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe probably to most people, if they see an account for Mr. X or Mrs. Y, they see that as an account and they affiliate that person with an elected official. And it doesn't matter that it's a Peter Fay account or a Councillor Fay account. So as members of council, you need to be mindful that wherever you are and whatever medium, that people see you as an elected official, and you should conduct yourself accordingly. And I can't go into more specifics because I don't follow the members of council on your accounts.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So the Code of Conduct then applies on all of our comments when we're commenting online. For example, if a decision is made by the whole of council then we would be supporting that decision after the fact online when being asked questions. Would that be correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would say it could, and it could depending on whether or not you use that social media channel as your primary communication device and sort of your persona as an elected official, even though it's your personal account. So there's a number of factors that would come into play, but it could.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Councilman Sutton, you want to receive the report? Okay, in favor? Thank you. So, 8.3 is something I add, I think, did you want to add?
Do you want to speak?
Yeah, go ahead first. Councilman Medeiros?
Thank you, Councilor Fortini, as the chair, for adding this item while I was not here. It's just come through, to my knowledge, in previous council, as a practice, the mayor would have a blurb on each respective councilor's newsletter. I'm proposing here today, members of council, that the mayor be allowed to have his own newsletter, which frees up that space that belongs to us, and not confuse, especially with the various issues and positions on things, and I'll let you speak to it. So I guess the motion I would be moving today is that, similar to members of council, that the mayor also would have his own respective newsletter, and then after the space that's given to the mayor will no longer exist on councilors' respective newsletters.
Okay. So we're gonna ask for a report back, so, or are we just gonna?
So through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps I just want to get some clarity. 8.3 was on council meeting agendas, so is this related to that, or is this a new item?
Well, he was supposed to add something, so it's a new item, I guess.
So I think first thing you should do is add this to the agenda, because this is
Okay.
different.
So
And
reopen
then,
it. My apologies, councilors.
So can we reopen the two-thirds votes? All in favor?
Okay.
There you go.
so through you, Mr. Chair, if the motion would be that, a simple motion that the mayor be provided an opportunity for, I guess, twice yearly annual newsletters, and when we can come up with the wording in place of a dedicated space in the councilor newsletters. The only thing I wish to bring to committee's attention is there is a defined budget for newsletters, which is 204 or 5,000, if memory serves me. And I think what we're talking about then is potentially 4 newsletters that could go out over the course of the year. 2 for each of the council pairs, and possibly 2 for the mayor. Is that with the
Yeah,
intent?
so based on that, and I guess with the implied costs, and I would request a report back, I guess, with what the implications that would be for our consideration. It just, through the chair, it doesn't make sense that we have mixed messaging on our newsletters, and the mayor be afforded his own autonomy to do what he says, please, what he sees fit. Okay, is that a okay motion?
Okay, speaking to the motion, Councilor Williams.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, how much space does the mayor have for his blurb on the newsletter? A whole back page?
Through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps one of the members could comment. I think it's like half a page or within
I think it's the back half a page.
Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, I would support this motion, especially because as counselors, we're limited to 200 words. And it doesn't give us enough space to, share information. And I've always felt the newsletter, the information on it is pretty much prescribed. We are given a number of areas to choose from. And so, in order for us to have more space to be able to give our own information and expand on some of the information that we want to share, I think it would be really helpful for the mayor to have his own newsletter. And so I look forward to seeing the motion or the report that comes back on how much it would cost and what the implications would be if we move forward with this.
Thank you. Councilor Dillon.
Would this be mailed out separately or mailed with, your intention is to have it mailed with the newsletters, the councilors' newsletters?
My
Through the
intention
chair.
is really, thank you, Councillor Dillon. I assume that since we have a timetable, that the mayor's newsletter would be in accordingly. But I'm also, maybe for discussion, if it's up to respective councillors to send it at a different date, such as the region, have that discretion. It's really up to the area councillors. But I think right now, if I'm not mistaken, there's a timeline that we send it out, and I assume the mayor would mirror that timeline unless we decide to change that timeline.
Right, would staff also be looking, sorry, did you want to respond first? Or no? So would staff also be looking at other options as well? Maybe, I don't know if Councilor Medeiros is open up to it, maybe a complete separate page for the mayor within that newsletter? Or any other option that staff might feel would be appropriate.
Through you, Mr. Chair, staff will look at those options, but the primary option would be a separate newsletter afforded to the mayor. But we can look at other options as well.
Yeah, and that's fine. If that's an amendment that you want to look at, Councillor Dillon?
Sorry, through the chair, I'm just looking at, sorry, I'm just thinking about other alternatives that might be available that we can discuss.
Okay, Councillor Vicente.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no issue with the motion, be happy to support it. But also, I think that Councillor Williams made a very, very good point in that within the wards, there are so many amazing stories that we want to communicate with the members of the public. I would definitely be, having worked through newsletters in the past and particularly newsletters now, space is always, very tight and perhaps too tight with the format that members of council are afforded now. So if staff could come back also with alternatives in terms of number of pages or the size of the newsletter. At the end of the day, as I understand it with bulk mailing, the final folded size of the newsletter is independent of the cost that you pay for the bulk mailing. And so Canada Post allows bulk mail to be a certain size, and whether it's one page, 2 page, or a smaller or larger page folded to the correct format, the cost to the city is the same. So if we could look at those options as well as a friendly amendment to Councillor Medeiros' motion.
So just ask, for the newsletter, is it a 2, Peter, I can't remember now, or is it a 3 folded?
I believe through you, Mr. Chair, it is a folded. So I
So
think
it's just folded.
11 by 17 folded, so it's 8.5 by 11.
So- Is there a difference in cost if we have it in 3, of the same size, we have more pages when you open it up, or a lot more? We can look at that when
we can look at that, Mr. Chair.
And that way, maybe you could give a whole page or a page and a half to the mayor, and we still have the same, we'll have 2.5 pages for ourselves. We have an extra half a page now. All right. Okay, so, thank you, Councilor Medeiros. So there's one more, I put this one forward, 8.3, and this was just, we have to vote on that, on the motion?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. All in favor of Councilor Medeiros' motion? Yep, all in favor, carries. So 8.3, I think we went to 8.4. Councilor Medeiros came a little bit late, but I wanted to add something on the agendas, Peter. We're getting the agendas a little bit late, you know? Maybe if we could see if we could get them a little bit, like this one here Friday was delivered at 7 o'clock at night. We had, all of us were very busy this weekend. So going through all these policies, if we actually wanted to read everything, we would have to read everything this morning. And this happens also in other agendas, maybe. And on the code, I know you provided the code. If we could actually use the same code, every week it's a different code. So at the region, we have our own code. And, you know, you don't have to always go in and check for a code, maybe just keep it the same if we could do that. And each one's responsible for their own code. And we could change our own code if we wanted. That's the region. If you can look at that.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we can look at that. We decided to, when we piloted this closed session distribution electronically, it was to have a unique code every time, just to ensure that it's more secure. But as we work towards a replacement agenda management system, that is something we can look at, because the region is looking at this, a similar system to, I think, what the city's looking at.
Okay, and my second question is, can we also add that we could print the in-camera? Now that we're paying for our paper and the expenses, I want to see my paperwork, so I'm going through. So sometimes it's hard to print.
Through you, Mr. Chair, if that is the will of committee, the reason we did not turn on the print function for closed session is to maintain the confidentiality and minimize risks for potential leaks, inadvertent or advertent, in keeping with previous council direction.
Okay, well,
But if that's the will of committee, I would prefer that there's a motion that directs staff to do
I'll put one
that.
forward, because at the region, they allow us to print it, and we're responsible. So if we have our staff there, and we're giving my staff to print something, I gotta trust her. Then if that's the case, I'm still responsible as a counselor, whoever gets access to it. So I'm asking.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we are still sending the emails and the electronic closed session to yourself.
Right.
Because depending on the closed session and the nature of the business that may be in there, it may impact some of the individuals involved. So that's just something the members need to be mindful of.
Excellent. Okay, so I'll put the motion for. Sorry, Councilor Dillon?
Just a question to Peter. Right now, going forward as of the 15th, will the closed session, is that allowed to be read by any of the staff? Or is it strictly the councillors?
Through you, Mr. Chair, at this point, it is strictly for the councillors.
No, after the 15th.
It still is strictly for the councillors. The confidentiality of closed session is for a very limited number of individuals to maintain that confidentiality and ensure that inadvertent leaks do not happen. And that's why when we distribute paper copies in an envelope, we say to be only opened by the councillor, the person.
So I know the mayor's chief of staff is now allowed within closed session. At the beginning of last term, I recall Councillor Gibson had said that previous to previous, anybody and everybody used to come in the meetings, and so last term of council closed it off to only members of council and I guess the required staff that needs to be there. If we were to get an executive assistant, can we have it so that we're able to share this with the executive assistant only?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would.
Not enter the actual meeting itself, but be able to read, and so we're able to go over the agenda with them.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the ethical framework for all the council office staff does address confidentiality and maintaining confidentiality regardless of what it involves. It does not allow them to enter closed session. I would be very careful with entertaining going down that path, and perhaps I would suggest wait until 6 months under council's belt with the new council office staff model, because all it takes is an inadvertent release of something, and the member of council is responsible at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So my advice at this point would be to wait.
Okay, fair enough.
Councilor Medeiros.
I wanted to add, I'm thinking this is another item that I might have to put forward, that we might have to get 2/3 again. So I'll defer and support your motion. Thanks.
Well, you could add an amendment.
It's just regarding to phone usage. So I don't think it would be relevant for this item.
Okay. So I got the motion there, so that the members of council be permitted to access to print closed session materials.
All in favor?
All in favor? Okay, that's great. Can we add? Would you like to add your?
Yeah, I'd like to add
So, could we reopen again?
again,
Councilor Medeiros?
2/3.
This is not something we do every week, but 2/3. All in favor? Go ahead.
Carried, thank you.
Go ahead, Councilor.
The discussion regarding phone usage, I know there was a motion in council, so for new councilors, you may notice that we used to read out that thou shalt not use your phone and all devices and stuff, which we don't do at the region, but it was council of last term thought of in their wisdom to pass that, and just more of a housekeeping. So I find it ironic when we read out that statement, and I know we've stopped reading that out, but reading it out, and yet we still work and we keep in contact with our constituents. So just from the city clerk's perspective, would you not be, I guess, in agreement? Because to simply not read it out doesn't mean the motion still doesn't exist. So I would like to put a motion to remove that provision, I'll say. Put a motion to move that provision, as at the time I argued that each councillor is responsible for their own actions and should be self-regulated. And in this time of age, all of us are, as I see, our commissioners are constantly dealing with requests and dealing in contact. So I just think from visual, there's a irony there when people are seeing us, we read that, and then after many of us are on our devices right away. So I just think that from a transparency perspective, that we would clean that. And the second part, and I guess for discussion, is regarding phone uses in camera. I'm not sure if this is the appropriate venue, City Clerk? Okay, and again, at the region, we don't say remove your phones or not allowed be on your devices in camera. Yet, I guess there is a culture of leaks and so on and so on. I don't think, again, I'd like to put a motion that we be allowed, again, to, at each councilor's discretion, use appropriate what devices or technology they feel, be it in camera or be it in council. And I'll open it up if there are any questions, comments, or it's just there's no consistency with the region. At the region, it's completely opposite. So I just think that everyone should be responsible for their own actions and be consistent with what they deem fit, and be judged upon how they regulate themselves and conduct themselves in council. So I'll put that motion. No questions or comments? That's
Okay.
President.
Let's just,
All in favor?
we're gonna put it on the board, or you're just fine with it without writing it? Okay. So all in favor?
So is there, are we understood then?
Oh,
Okay,
just quick. So we already voted on it?
so this is in council and in camera. Okay,
Listed to the phone and electronic.
So through you, Mr. Chair, then there's two motions. One is to rescind the prohibition on phone use during council and committee meetings
Yeah.
by members of council. And second is to allow phone use for communication purposes only. It should not be used for recording in closed session. Because right now we are allowing iPads and other devices
Yeah.
because we're sending out the closed session material electronically. So
Again.
members have to use that to
that's
review
right.
the
It's
material.
not, I think it's self-evident not to divulge sensitive information of the corporation.
Okay. All in favor of the motion? It's carried. Okay. Deferred, nothing. Motion, no, nothing. Correspondences. Counselor, question period. Anybody has any questions? Once, twice, none. Seeing none. On public question period. No? Good. Closed session and adjourned. So at the next meeting, I guess we'll.
Mr. Chair,
Sorry.
so clerk staff are proposing if we get on a regular schedule now for this committee meeting quarterly, we'll canvass, but we're looking at May 6th, September 16th, and November 4th. We'll canvass your offices. I'm presuming a 1 o'clock start time is preferred by this committee. Otherwise, we can canvass for 9:30, but if 1 o'clock is preferred, we'll do that.
Oh, no, not 30.
9:30 is fine, you know, see what, I'm fine, 9:30. In case we have, yeah. So 1 o'clock. So we're okay with it? You guys okay 9:30 or 1 o'clock? Okay. So I guess we'll canvass and see how they are. Okay, thank you. So adjournment. Thank you.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Maneros, no. Peter? Peter?